Wow. Well, I hope the rest of the day goes like that, that's all I can say. Weren't our speakers wonderful? Absolutely great. I think I must just be inspired all over again. I was just thinking of one issue about why they didn't legislate for X in the 20 years. And it's always a question, and you always get kind of excuses. But the strangest thing, there's so much detail in the European Court, in the ABC case. They go into the history in detail of the whole abortion debate all over the years. And it's one of the things that the European Court said. They couldn't find a plausible explanation. And the reason for that is that there just is only one. There is no separation of church and state in this country. We pretend there is, but there just isn't. So, on that note, any questions?
Hi, I'm Antiabortion, I'm with Choice Ireland, and I'm pro-choice. Just last night I was having a debate with my uncle, and he's very religious, he's quite Catholic. And it happens every time we meet up. But now that I myself am pregnant, I'm 3 months pregnant, I was telling you yesterday, he's over the moon, he's really happy, and I was like, now that I'm pregnant, I realise that, I'm even more angry that women would be forced to go through. It's just uproots your life, and I had the debate with him all over again, but he always goes back to the same issue. It always goes back to philosophy for him. He always goes back to the issue of life and when it starts and the morality of it, and even in rape cases, he still, disagrees with abortion on morality terms. And obviously, I'm an atheist, so I was like, well, your morality is not the same as mine. But how do I answer that? Like, how do I come up with a reasonable answer for him? Because I find it really difficult when I'm debating him, because he always goes to that issue, the issue of when does life start, that life has a right to live its course, even if it impacts on the woman, even if it impacts on the woman's health. In fact, he still thinks that the woman is not entitled to abortion. So I just, if anyone on the panel has a good answer to that question, I would love to hear it.
Yes. Do you want to take that straight away? Answer that?
I don't know why I'm being looked at, but just these are very difficult situations, and I think on the whole they're best avoided, because it is actually probably fairly difficult to have an argument with somebody who is very convinced on that grounds and who's not going to actually look at the reality of a spectrum where, comparing a fertilized ovum, as I think was it Anthea was saying, with the life of a grown woman. Myself at the moment, what I was very struck by, I think it was after the inquest, Praveen Halapanavar said, there has to be a difference made. We have to be able to make distinctions, and we have to value the bigger life. And I really felt that that was such a humane and a human way of talking about these philosophical angels dancing on the heads of pins questions that we get, that I think we do always have to remember, bear in mind, support and defend the right of the bigger life. That is to say, the grown woman who is there before the doctor or whoever, and to make sure that her life is actually protected.
Can I just get across, just for Abigail, Uncle Rooney, please feel free to use the list of comparative views from major and minor world religions on when and if we quantify life beginning. There is no ultimate truth, and therefore it is wrong to impose any one of those many perspectives as an ultimate truth that constrains the behaviour of women. You might just give him some reading material. Yeah, I actually gave this to this speech to the Irish Times. So it's up on the Irish Times website. So there's some reference to all those things. They're just a start, but they're a starting point of debate, and it's not all black and white.
One thing I like to point out on this is that they're actually not talking about life, because life can mean weeds, fleas, viruses. It can, lots of things are alive that people don't want to keep alive forever. they're really talking about personhood, and it's not necessarily easy to change the mind of somebody who thinks he's talking about life, but is actually talking about personhood. But still, you can say, well, it's not really life you're worried about, it's the fact that it's a human life. And that's when questions of degree can come into play, because a fetus is not as much like a human person as a grown person is. So you can talk about the spectrum, and do you really want to grant full human rights to something that is actually still in development?
Anything else?
Okay, so Donnelly of Atheist Ireland. First, thanks for organising this to everyone here. It's amazing. But I'm really asking about, Claire mentioned that the anti-abortion lobby, they have huge access to media. I was thinking, well, technically so do we. We have a lot of allies in the mainstream media. Let's not be wrong on this. We have Ray Darcy, we have Whitson Brown, and so on and so forth. So, and youth defense has a lot going against them. They have connection to the German Nazi Party, which are well established, which are well known really. We all know where their funding comes from, and that is iffy. At the moment they have the thing going with the illegal postering and so on. So why don't we go on the mainstream media? I know all that stuff from Wikipedia, I know all that stuff from indie media, blah, 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 blah. I don't know it from mainstream media. So why don't we use our access to mainstream media that we by all means have to expose all these things about youth defense, to expose who they really are? I think that would be a really important thing to do, and I think it would help us. Don't know, what do you think?
Well, first of all, I think we do actually work very hard. I think everybody on this platform certainly has an experience of, you know, seeking access to the media and of finding that it's actually very limited. And the impact of the McKenna judgment, which really should only apply to, I think, elections and to referendums, is that our national broadcaster in particular has a notion that you always have to have 50-50 a balance. And so many times I've had, you know, somebody ring and say, will you come on such and such a programme or whatever, but I won't be able to confirm that until I've lined up the other side. And I'm there thinking, well, please don't line up the other side. I'd far rather get, you know, 6 minutes instead of 3 minutes to maybe have a bit more time to explain a perspective in more detail. But that just simply doesn't happen. And it is always presented and framed as a for and against situation, so that it's actually extremely difficult to have the kind of rational discussions and the kind of more expansive you know, going over of situations and experiences and so on. And I think that we have ironically been very hampered by this interpretation of the McKenna judgment as meaning that every time there is this particular political issue, because I'm not sure that it applies to everything, that you have to have an absolutely equal for and against. But I'm sure others have other...
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt there are individual journalists and media people who are very progressive views, but in general the owners of the mainstream media would adopt that sort of more conservative or what they call balanced view. But if you hear this, like they say it all the time, this is a very divisive issue, it's a very emotive issue. Well, actually for most people it isn't, and they bandy this around as if it's a fact. But my experience is it isn't. They try to create it so, to whip up this debate and this frenzy, which in my experience, most people who see a programme are here to, oh here, not listening to that and switch it off, because most people are more balanced and know where they fit themselves. So I do think the point you're making about the particularly sort of pernicious influence of youth defence and how appalling they are is something that needs to be honed in on. I think it's good that people have focused on how offensive their advertisement has been, and you know, we're certainly trying to take that up with various ministers and so on, and that should be exploited. But the real problem is not really them, it's the sort of politicians who won't challenge anything on any issue because of fear of offending someone and therefore losing some votes no matter what. And our classic example was that of the number of, when we moved the bill the first time round, the number of Labour people who said, fair play to you, that's great, you go and do the running on that. they didn't do anything, didn't vote for the bill. The number of Fianna Fáilers who said, yeah, personally I agree with you, but if you think I'm coming out and saying that with people in my constituency sending me emails, you must be joking. So completely just out to save their own skin, you know. But I do agree, you know, we could zone in on youth defence a bit more, but they're not the big problem really is the political establishment more so on their cowardice, you know.
I might just add there, we're waiting for the mic, that there's a youth defence protest, I think, lined up for the 6th of July. And we are actually planning through Action on X and various other organisations to have a silent protest, a silent gathering alongside the youth defence protest that day, and that will be opposite the Spire in O'Connell Street. So the more people who come along prepared to stand silently, to bear witness to the fact that there is another, there is another way of thinking about this, the better, because they'll be bussed up from everywhere.
In Mesankari, Poland, I have a question to the doctor. You said that in face of actively dying patient, the doctors always want to do anything to, whatever, something like that, anything to save the life of the patient. And I was surprised by hearing this word want. The doctors want. Don't they have to? Do you have a Hippocratic Oath? I don't know. In Poland or in many countries, students of medicine, when they finish their studies, they pronounce this Hippocratic Oath. So I wonder how it would be, how it would sound. I will always save the life unless it is the life of pregnant woman, or unless. What isn't it the problem for the medical community, for your corporation? Is it discussed? How do you as doctors deal with it as moral issue?
Well, I suppose a few things. The first thing is the Hippocratic Oath differs from place to place. So in Ireland, it's not taken. And certainly if you actually look at the old version of the Hippocratic Oath, it would debar you from being a surgeon, as it says you can't cut people. And there's very many different versions of it depending on where you go. In terms of why I said you want to save an actively dying patient always, as opposed to have to, is that even if someone refuses a treatment that will help them, you have to go along with their wishes. So and you may want them to go along with what you're saying, but they may consider that not to be in their best interest. In the case of pregnancy, you may feel that a termination is the best course of action for a woman who is potentially dying. They may not want that. That is their right. In terms of the current situation in Ireland, because of the legal scenario at the minute, it is very much a grey area. And to be honest, the grey area doesn't change that much with the legislation in terms of when someone's health versus life is at risk and how that kind of goes forward. I think most doctors are interested in doing the best for their patients, but the problem is that from a legal perspective with the Constitution, the way it is, you're meant to view it as two separate patients. And that presents a lot of difficulties. And with the right to the life of the unborn, as it said in the Constitution, you're meant to give equal rights to both. So that presents a difficult legal position. And doctors are very careful legally. We have to be, because otherwise we risk, huge costs, but also medical licenses and all the rest. I think that what is important here is that the legislation tries to provide some clarity in terms of being able to intervene in a legislative framework, but ultimately it doesn't go anywhere near far enough in terms of doctors being able to do their job properly. And for me, a doctor doing their job properly is working with the patient, informing them of risks, of the reality of a situation, and then deciding with that patient what the best course of action is. So in the case of Savita Halbanavar in Galway, for me, when she asked for a termination and when she knew what the situation was, as should have been explained to her, I'm not sure if it was or wasn't, that should have been taken on board, and legislatively you can't do that because her life was not at that point in time at risk. So that's a problem for me.
Yeah, just on this side.
Hi, I'm Jill Sullivan. I've been an abortion rights activist for the last 21 years. I'm involved with the abortion rights campaign. I'd like to ask the panel their views in line with what we've seen in America, in the United States of America, not Canada. They're rowing back, or what is called the war against women, in regards to the access to abortion facilities, services, even with Roe versus Wade in the state. I know there's a big push to repeal the 8th Amendment. It is morally wrong. It should not be in our constitution. But we've already seen which the proposed legislation for the Protecting of Life during Pregnancy Bill, they're listing facilities, they're listing doctors, they're already putting in convoluted procedures. Is there a concern that we might actually repeal the 8th Amendment and then see further legislation to restrict the access to abortions that are needed here? And what would be your concerns about that?
Well, one thing I know about the situation in the US is that however much we still have the judicial decision, Roe v. Wade, we have a de facto situation in which abortion has been drastically whittled away by all kinds of means, with the result that in many, many, many places, it's simply not available. It's legal, but it's not available. And one way that's been accomplished is just plain intimidation. There are an awful lot of doctors who just don't want to touch abortion because they're scared to, for obvious reasons. You know, there's a remote chance that you could be killed, but you also have to live with possibly endless demonstrations and intimidation and mobs outside your clinic, all the way up to arson, violence, murder. So yeah, I mean, legality is certainly not the whole ballgame. There's always the potential for all kinds of democratic action, so to speak.
My name's Maeve Berger. I'm a consultant psychiatrist, and I've been practicing here for the last almost 5 years now. I have been working in New York for 35 years, where abortion was completely legal. Imagine my concern in terms of the issue of trying to do what's best for your patients. When I saw this lady who clearly needed to have, she'd already had 5 kids, needed to have a discussion of how abortion might be explored as a measure. Her husband still wanted her to have an abortion. Anyway, the story is I put it in a letter to the GP that I had explored the issue of abortion with her. I got a phone call to say, do you know that you've broken the law? It had a chilling effect. What I've done since then is I do what I think I should do as a consultant psychiatrist. I discuss the issues with the patients in the same way. I don't put it in writing anymore. I was told I was breaking the law. Now, I don't think I can be put in jail for 14 years, but I've read that in the paper, and it is chilling. So I hope that when they put an amendment to this bill eventually, they look at the criminalization aspect in terms of healthcare professionals. Thank you.
Legally, from when talking about crisis pregnancy woman, if she asks about abortion, you can talk about abortion, that's fine, you can give information. You can't arrange an abortion for that person, they have to do it themselves. But if you talk about abortion, you have to legally talk about adoption and parenting. Interestingly, it doesn't work the other way around. So there's that factor to it. And certainly in terms of a chill factor, there are lots of people who I've spoken to who were like, I totally support Doctors for Choice, I think you're great, I wouldn't join you. Who, because of fear about what certain patients may think. And certainly that is a huge factor, that around, for doctors to stand up and say, look, I'm pro-choice, is still quite difficult. And as a profession, particularly among the older generation, it's still quite conservative. And that's a problem now that is changing, and certainly among younger doctors, there is a very different attitude there. And I think if you look at Galway, the chill effect was a huge factor there.
Can I just say about the chill effect and medicine? The most terrifying thing for me, and coming back to the Polish woman's question, the risk factor. Are there many states where there is a risk factor for patient and doctor in terms of risk? If a doctor risks performing a termination and it is later challenged by a colleague, an objecting colleague or a relation of the woman, they are still liable under the 1861 Act to life imprisonment. That's a terrible position to put any physician in, to make that decision and bear consequences when that medical decision made with good faith is challenged. And it can be.
Could I just come back on that, on Janet's question as well, actually, and in relation to yours? And every time we have these discussions, it never fails to strike me that there is, if there weren't so much at stake in terms of women's health and lives and right to make our own decisions, that there is really an aspect of pantomime about it. It becomes almost like it's farcical when you actually tease it all out. But that farce is a very, very dangerous one. But just thinking that, there is, of course, a point that when the Eighth Amendment is actually repealed, that there will then be a vacuum. And it's at that time, obviously, that we will have to be, but in the lead up, we can't really have the Eighth Amendment repealed until such time as we're very clear about what direction we're going to be going in. But it does seem to me, and picking up on what Ross was saying there, it's something I meant to say if I hadn't actually left out half my talk, is that we point the finger quite rightly at the Catholic Church in this country, but we also have to look at the role of the establishment, and in the establishment and their cowardice, looking at the medical profession and also the legal profession. And it is certainly true, which is why Doctors for Choice is so important, that pro-choice perspective and position needs so desperately to be developed and nurtured in this country, because I think it is true that until the medical profession and the legal profession actually move out into the centre and take up this issue and courageously do so and not leave the relatively small group still of Doctors for Choice to do so, is going to be very difficult to repeal the Eighth Amendment. And I do resent how conservative those professions are. I really do, and I think they have a huge responsibility, which they have absolutely shirked, and they're happy to blame government, they're happy to blame the church, but they have a role to play, and they should play it, and it's up to us to keep saying that every time we go to the doctor, to actually say, are you pro-choice? Well, if you're not, I'm changing GP now. And I think we need to do that in this country.
Any more questions? The left here. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, my name is Bernard Cooley, and I was just wondering, my question is, are we living in a secular state? As in, my belief is that, my awareness is that we're a Republic of Ireland. And I know that everyone's pointing the finger at the church, but really is it not our parliament that we have to worry about? As in, we are entitled to disagree with the church. We've got divorce, for example. Okay, it's a 5-year process. I understand that. But I'm just wondering, the church is just an institution, and we shouldn't, in my opinion, I'm not so worried about the church itself, because I'm more worried for our politicians that they fear such an institution.
I know where you're coming from, and I would kind of largely agree in terms of the attitudes of most ordinary people. There is a sort of a de facto separation. Even Catholics don't adhere to the teachings of the Catholic Church in terms of, sexuality and morality and stuff in the main, and largely ignore the teachings there. In that sense, yes, it is the political establishment, but also the residue influence of the Catholic Church's influence in terms of education and the health service. And it's very much ingrained there. So it's not just the frock coat or the nun's habit or the priest that's there, but it's the influence of the church as an institution in our health and education system. against the backdrop of a very weak-kneed political establishment who just don't want to rock the boat and don't want to be seen to be alienating anybody and are a little bit behind the consciousness of people. So I think that's where your problem is. I think certainly in terms of their influence, while they've been very vocal and have been sending out the letters, they haven't convinced people on this. The church are not the force they once were in society, but they have the benefit of those institutions still under their influence, and that's where we need to chip away. And I very strongly agree with the points that Alva made. It's the old medical hierarchy, the old educational hierarchy in the institutions, in the universities. I mean, the number of doctors who are even qualified in this country to carry out an abortion, you could count on one hand. So, do you know, it's just not there. That's where the influence is, and on the politicians rather than on the population, you know.
Also, there's the Constitution to bear in mind. We are labouring under a Constitution that we're really doing wonderful things with it in Constitutional Convention. It's starting to move away from it. But it is very heavily influenced by Catholicism. And I mean, you saw the Women in the Home clause, which they debated quite successfully, and will probably get changed. But everything has to go to an amendment, and everything has to be. A constitution is very difficult. It's like a liner, turning a liner in the sea. It's a very difficult thing to turn around quickly. So politicians are constrained by that, and there is a fair smattering and sniff of Catholicism running through the spine of our constitution.
They turn it around pretty fast, though, when it's about European treaties, don't they?
I have to take one more question, just.
Thanks, Jane. My name is Leonie. I'm a member of Atheist Ireland. I'm also an ex-Catholic. I was a Catholic for a very long time, and then I did science in university. One of the striking things to me in relation to the first question that was asked about how to change the minds of people and how to value women's rights over the rights of an embryo or a fetus was education, was the education that I saw, the very visual representation of a ball of cells, the blastula, morula, that sort of thing. That changed my mind. That made me think, how can a God value that as much as me? And I was just wondering, is there any way we could get basic biology taught at a better level to indoctrinate children with science and reality rather than faith and unsubstantiated beliefs?
Well, that's the answer, isn't it? Education and science are the way forward, you know, but yeah, it has to be lobbied for and put out there. But I do think there's a growing realisation amongst people, and it's certainly in a completely different era and understanding now than it was even 20, 25 years ago. You know, when anybody who discussed abortion immediately did so with an apology that they didn't agree with it, they weren't for it themselves, but a sort of begrudging recognition that it maybe happened somewhere. There was nobody, or very, very few people getting up and openly being able to say they were pro-choice. And one of the striking things when we moved the legislation the first time round was that a lot of the media people and radio journalists were saying that it was kind of the first time people were openly talking about this in workplaces, and it's relatively common now for people to say, well, yes, I've had an abortion, or my friend has, or my sister, and these would, and respecting other people's decision making has moved on dramatically. You know?
Okay, I think we'll have to wrap that up. We have tea outside now. We're a bit off schedule. We have a panel later with 3 people on, and we'll make up some time there. And thank you all very much. And I'd like to thank our panellists. I give them a round of applause.